They followed the human woman into the maintenance tunnel. Then the doors sealed. The alarm did not give me time to think. It never does. I was halfway through a cold cup of coffee when the station shook. Not a big shake. Not the kind that throws you off your feet. Just a deep, low vibration that moved through the floor and up through the soles of my boots. The kind that tells you something important has gone wrong somewhere below you. I had felt that feeling before. I put the cup down. My name is Yara Voss. I am a human. I am 31 years old, and I have spent the last 2 years living inside a rotating metal structure called Keth Varuna Station, which floats in deep space roughly 4 light-years from the nearest human settlement. I am one of 3 humans on a station that houses 412 living beings from 11 different species. My official title is Engineering Specialist, Grade 3. My unofficial title, the one the other crew members use when they think I cannot hear them, translates roughly from the Vrethki language as the small one who goes into the walls. They are not wrong. That is exactly what I do. Keth Varuna is an old station. It was built before any human had ever left the solar system, back when the Galactic Concordat was still a collection of treaties rather than a government. The station was designed by 3 species working together, which sounds impressive until you realize that each of those 3 species had completely different ideas about what a corridor should look like, how wide a door should be, and how much a ceiling should bend. The result is a structure that makes perfect sense if you have lived in it long enough, and no sense at all if you have not. Underneath the main living decks, beneath the cargo bays and the docking rings and the water recycling units, runs the tunnel grid. 40 kilometers of pressurized maintenance passages, some of them wide enough to drive a vehicle through, some of them narrow enough that I have to turn sideways and hold my breath. The grid is where all the important things happen quietly. The pipes that carry atmosphere, the cables that carry power, the joints where heat moves from one section to another. The grid is the circulatory system of the station. If it fails, everything fails. I am one of the few people on this station who knows the grid well. I spent my first week aboard completely lost in it. After that, I mapped every single passage myself, by hand, because the official maps had not been updated in 30 years and were wrong in 14 places I could find. I know where the ceilings get low. I know which sections flood when the condensation management fails. I know where the emergency lighting flickers, and where it does not come on at all. When the station shook, I already knew what section had failed before the alert came through my communicator. I could feel it in the vibration. The atmospheric regulation node in grid section 14, one of the 6 main junctions that controlled the pressure balance across the entire lower deck. My communicator buzzed. The station AI spoke in its calm, even voice. Atmospheric cascade failure detected across grid sections 7 through 23. 6 primary junctions are compromised. Coolant venting is active. Engineering response required immediately. I was already pulling on my suit. The maintenance suit is not elegant. It is a full-body shell of insulated material, sealed at the wrists and neck, with a helmet that locks into place with a sound like a vault closing. It smells like rubber and old metal on the inside. I have worn it so many times that I no longer notice. I grabbed my toolkit from the locker beside my bunk. The toolkit is a flat case about the size of a briefcase, filled with tools that most of the other species on this station cannot identify, because they were designed for human hands. Small hands, precise hands, hands that can reach into spaces where larger fingers cannot go. I was out of my quarters and moving down the corridor before the second alert sounded. The section that had failed was 3 levels below me. I took the maintenance lift instead of the main crew elevator, because the maintenance lift goes directly to the grid access points, and the main elevator does not. The lift is small and smells like machine oil, and the door rattles when it moves. I have always liked it. It feels honest. I was on the 4th level down when the second group of crew members found me. They were waiting at the grid access corridor, 4 of them, standing in a loose cluster near the heavy door that led into the tunnel grid. They had been sent there by the station commander, I learned later. The commander had decided that a team should accompany me into the grid, rather than sending me alone. I understood the reasoning. 6 failing junctions was not a small problem. It would take time. It would take more hands than mine. I looked at the 4 of them, and I made quick assessments, the way you do when you are moving fast and you do not have time to be polite about it. The first was Seth. He was Vrethki, which meant he was tall, pale, and angular, with large eyes that picked up low light and a narrow face that always looked slightly disapproving, even when he was in a perfectly good mood. Seth was a senior engineer. He had been on this station for 6 years. He was experienced, careful, and deeply skeptical of improvisation. He was looking at me the way someone looks at a weather forecast they do not trust. The second and third were Vale and Mira, both Solani. They were smaller than Seth, rounder, with pale silver skin and large dark eyes that blinked slowly when they were thinking. Solani were excellent technical minds. They followed procedure with a thoroughness that I genuinely respected. They were both looking at their communicators, reading the technical data on the failure, which told me they were taking this seriously. The fourth was Kethran. He was Dorai, and he was built like a wall had decided to become a person. The Dorai were a security-minded species, where Seth was an engineer, and Vale and Mira were technicians. Kethran was a tactical officer assigned to the engineering response, because cascade failure in a confined space was considered a structural risk situation. He stood with his arms at his sides and watched me approach with an expression that gave nothing away. "You are Voss," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. I reached the grid access door and put my hand on the control panel. "Has anyone been inside yet?" "No," Seth said. "We were waiting for you." "We should not go in yet," Seth added. "We should wait for the secondary assessment team to confirm the extent of the atmosphere in Junction 14 is failing right now," I said. "The secondary assessment team will arrive in approximately 40 minutes. We have less than that before the cascade reaches the primary pressure core. When it does, we lose atmosphere across 6 crew decks." I looked at him. "We are not waiting." Seth opened his mouth to respond. I opened the door. The tunnel grid opened in front of us. The light inside was dim and yellow. The kind of light that comes from emergency strips mounted low on the walls rather than from overhead panels. The passage was about 2 meters wide, with a ceiling low enough that Seth would have to bend his head slightly. The air smelled like heated metal and something sharp and chemical. Coolant, venting from somewhere ahead. I stepped through the door. After a moment, I heard 4 sets of footsteps behind me. We walked for about 2 minutes before the door sealed. I did not hear the explosion. It was too far away, deep in a section of the grid that I knew was under heavy stress. What I heard was the emergency system responding to it, a deep, resonant tone, a mechanical sound heavy and final like the closing of an enormous book. And then the station AI spoke again, from the speakers embedded in the tunnel walls, in the same calm voice it always used no matter what it was saying. "Grid sections 7 through 23 are now under emergency containment protocol. All blast doors in the affected corridor system have been sealed. This is an automated response to secondary structural risk. Estimated repair window for door unsealing, 14 to 20 hours. Organic life support in affected sections, 6.3 hours. The yellow emergency lights continued to glow. The air continued to smell like coolant. I stood still for a moment and took stock of what we had. 6.3 hours of breathable air in the tunnels. 14 to 20 hours before the doors would unseal. 4 alien crew members behind me in the dark. 6 failing atmospheric junctions somewhere ahead of me. A toolkit in my hand and a suit on my back. I turned around, the 4 of them were looking at me. Seth's large pale eyes were wide. Vale and Mira stood very close together. Kethran had not moved at all, but something in the set of his shoulders had changed. A subtle tightening, like a structure bracing for load. I had seen that look before, not on aliens, on humans, on a mountainside when the weather had changed in the wrong direction, on a research vessel when the navigation system had gone dark 3 days from port. The look of someone who has just understood the full dimensions of a problem and is now waiting for someone to tell them what to do next. I clicked my headlamp on. The beam cut through the dimness and pointed forward, down the long passage toward the failing junctions. "All right," I said. "Let us talk about what we are going to do." The first thing I did was count, not the junctions, not yet. I counted what we had. 1 human engineer who knew the grid, 4 alien crew members with different skills, my toolkit, whatever each of them was carrying, the air in the suits we wore, supplemented by the station's tunnel atmosphere, which was rated at 6.3 hours and already ticking down. Emergency lighting. A communication system that could reach the station's main computer but could not reach any crew member outside the sealed sections. I said all of this out loud, not to impress anyone, not to calm anyone down. I said it out loud because when you are moving fast, and you have a lot of information to process, saying it out loud forces you to slow down just enough to hear yourself. And when you hear yourself, you catch the errors. It is a habit I learned from an older engineer named Callum, who worked the deep-sea rigs on Earth's northern shelf. He used to say that the mouth is a second brain, and I have found him correct more often than not. Seth crossed his arms as I spoke. "We should conserve air," he said. "Minimal activity. Wait for the rescue team." "The rescue team will not arrive before the air runs out," I said. "The station will prioritize." The station's systems are currently managing a cascade failure across 6 primary junctions, a containment lockdown across 17 sections, and whatever secondary damage caused the second explosion. The rescue team will come. They will just not come in time. I looked at him steadily. So we are going to fix it from the inside. Seth looked at the tunnel walls around us, at the low ceiling, at the coolant mist that was drifting faintly from somewhere further down the passage. You intend to repair 6 atmospheric junctions using a personal toolkit in a locked maintenance tunnel with 6 hours of air. 5 junctions, I said. Junction 12 was already partially repaired last week. I can finish it in about 10 minutes. The other 5 will take longer. I opened my toolkit and began sorting through it. Vavel, Mira, do either of you carry Concordat standard issue diagnostic units? The two Solani exchanged a glance. Mira reached into the pack at her side and pulled out a flat silver device about the size of my palm. Standard diagnostic array, she said. Full sensor range, good. I need you to walk 30 meters ahead and take pressure readings at every joint. Panel you see on the left wall. Each one has a small sensor port circular about this wide. I showed her with my fingers. Read the output and tell me the numbers. Mira nodded and moved forward without hesitation. I noticed that. Vale said, I can assist with the junction couplings if you can show me the schematic. Solani engineering certification covers Concordat standard atmospheric systems. That was better than I had expected. Good. Then you are with me on each junction. I looked at Kethran. He had not spoken yet. He was watching me the way a person watches something that does not yet make sense to them, but that they are beginning to suspect might be important. What is your training? I asked. Tactical response. Structural breach assessment. Controlled demolitions. A pause. I have basic engineering certification. Controlled demolitions, I said. I noted that. I did not say anything else about it yet. And Seth. I turned to the Vrethki engineer. You know Concordat atmospheric systems better than anyone else here. I need you to stop waiting for rescue and start thinking about how these 6 junctions connect to each other. If we fix them in the wrong order, the pressure re-equalization could rupture the secondary lines. I need a sequencing plan. Can you do that? Seth was quiet for a long moment. His pale eyes moved between me and the passage and the readout on his communicator. Then, with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who is deciding something, he uncrossed his arms. I can do that, he said. We moved. Junction 12 was easy, as I had said. The partial repair from the previous week had left the primary coupling correctly seated but the secondary seal ring loose. I tightened it with a tool that looked like a bent wrench, crossed with a screwdriver, a design that had been called ridiculous by every non-human engineer who had ever seen it, and that I had nonetheless found to be the single most useful thing in my toolkit. The coupling locked. The pressure readout on Mira's diagnostic unit shifted from red to amber. That is not green, Vale said. Not yet. It will stabilize once we clear the upstream junctions. This one is sealed. The pressure will equalize on its own. I moved forward. Next is junction 13. This one is going to be more difficult, Seth said from behind me. In what way? The primary intake pipe has a hairline fracture along the upper seam. The coolant you smell is coming from there. I cannot seal it from the outside because the thermal differential is too high. The metal is contracting unevenly. If I try to apply sealant now, it will not bond. I was already looking at the pipe as I spoke, running my light along its length. The fracture was exactly where I remembered it. I need to change the temperature of the metal before I seal it. How? Mira asked. By routing the coolant flow away from this section for approximately 4 minutes. That will let the pipe normalize. Then I can seal it before the coolant comes back. I crouched down and began examining the bypass valve at the base of the pipe. The bypass valve for this section is on the secondary panel, which is on the other side of that wall. Everyone looked at the wall. It was solid. It was also, as Seth immediately pointed out, load-bearing. I am not cutting through a load-bearing wall, Seth said, with the tone of a person who considers this to be the end of the discussion. I am not cutting through it either, I said. I am accessing the service crawl behind it. I pointed to a section of the wall that looked identical to every other section of the wall. There is a service access panel here. It was sealed during the Station 12 refit 4 years ago because it did not meet current fire containment code, but it was not physically removed. The panel is still here. It just has a code lock cover bolted over it. I reached into my toolkit and produced a flat prying tool. Vale, hold the light steady on this section. Vale held the light. I worked the tool into the seam of the code lock cover. It took about 90 seconds and a modest amount of force. The cover came away from the wall with a sound like a held breath being released. Behind it was a panel. Behind the panel was a crawl space about 60 centimeters wide, running horizontally behind the wall. Inside the crawl space, I could see the secondary control panel. I went in. I was the only one small enough. The space was tight and hot and smelled strongly of old dust and something electrical. I moved through it on my elbows and knees, counting my breaths. The secondary panel was about 2 meters in. I located the bypass valve in under a minute. Because I had looked at the schematic for this section so many times that I could draw it from memory, I activated the bypass. From outside the wall I heard Seth say, in a tone that sounded almost against his will, "The thermal reading on junction 13 is normalizing." "I know," I said from inside the wall. I came back out. I sealed the fracture with a 2-part polymer compound from my toolkit. I held it in place for 90 seconds while the compound cured. Then I deactivated the bypass and watched the pressure readout on Mira's unit climb, from red to amber to the very edge of green. "That is almost green," Vale said. "Close enough," I said. "It will complete the equalization on its own. We have 4 more junctions." I stood up and looked at the group. Sweat was collecting inside my suit. My knees ached from the crawl. I had a smear of polymer compound on my right glove. "How much air?" I asked. Kethran, who had been tracking it, said, 4 hours and 51 minutes. 4 junctions. 4 hours and 51 minutes. The math was not comfortable, but it was workable. I had done more with less before. What I had not counted on was Junction 15. Junction 15 was, by my assessment, one of the simpler repairs on the list. A pressure coupling, slightly misaligned, causing a cascade bleed in the main atmospheric line. The fix was straightforward. The problem was that Junction 15 was on the other side of a Type 4 blast door. I stood in front of the door and looked at it for a long time. A Type 4 blast door cannot be bypassed from the inside. It is designed specifically to prevent exactly that. It exists to stop fires, breaches, and pressure events from spreading across the grid during emergencies. It is made of 3 layers of reinforced alloy. It is sealed by an electromagnetic lock that can only be released from the outside or by the central station AI. During an emergency containment protocol, the AI will not release it until the protocol is lifted. The AI would not lift the protocol until the atmospheric junctions were repaired. The atmospheric junctions could not all be repaired until this door was opened. Seth stated this logic chain out loud, carefully, in the way of someone who wants to make sure everyone understands the full dimensions of the problem. Then he said, "We are in a closed loop." "Yes," I said. "There is no way through." I looked at the door for another few seconds. Then I started to laugh. It was a quiet laugh, more air than sound, but in the silence of the tunnel it carried. Keth Rand said without moving, "What is amusing?" "This door," I said. "I installed it." I crouched down in front of the lower left corner of the door frame. There was a section of wall paneling there, identical to the rest. I pressed my thumb against a specific point, about 15 centimeters above the floor, and the panel flexed slightly. "When I installed this door," I said, "I had to run a secondary power cable through the wall behind the lower frame. The cable conduit exits behind this panel. I used a non-standard connector because we were out of the correct size. The connector is accessible from this side if you remove the panel." "And?" Seth said. "And the Type 4 door's locking mechanism has a manual override port that is supposed to only be accessible from the outside. But the override cable runs through the same conduit as the power cable I installed. If I access the conduit and bypass the override relay directly, I can disengage the lock from this side."
Silence.
Then Kethran said slowly, "You installed a back door into an emergency containment system." "I installed a non-standard connector in a cable conduit," I said. "The implications are a separate issue." I began removing the panel. "I am going to file a report about it after we are not dying, if it would make you feel better." Seth made a sound that I could not interpret, but he came forward and crouched beside me to hold the panel steady while I worked. I found the conduit. I found the connector. I bypassed the override relay using a length of wire from my toolkit, and a technique that would have made my engineering professor deeply unhappy. The door's lock disengaged with a sound like a single heavy note. The door opened. 3 junctions left," I said, "and 3 hours and 22 minutes to do them in." I watched Kethran look at the open door, then at me, then at the door again. Something had shifted in his expression. It was not quite respect, not yet. It was the look of a soldier who has stopped assuming and started observing. "I think," he said quietly, "that you are a very unusual kind of person." "Every species thinks that about us," I said. "We tend to agree with them." I stepped through the door and kept moving. 3 junctions. 3 hours and 22 minutes. I want to tell you that the math was clean, that it worked out neatly, that everything moved at a steady pace, and the repairs went smoothly. I want to tell you that because it is the kind of story that makes sense, the kind where the timeline fits and the problems arrive in a sensible order. That is not what happened. Junction 16 took 40 minutes instead of 20, because the coupling that needed replacing had been installed at the wrong pressure tolerance, probably during a refit 3 years ago, and the replacement part in my toolkit was the correct specification. When I tried to fit it, it was too tight. I had to machine it down using a grinding tool that produced a sound like a cat arguing with a machine, and the noise in the tunnel was significant enough that Seth put his hands over the sensory organs on the sides of his head and asked me, with great patience, to please hurry. I hurried. Junction 17 was behind a secondary panel that turned out to be welded shut rather than bolted, which was a code violation that I made a mental note to add to my report, assuming I survived to write one. I could not cut through the weld with the tools I had. I stood in front of it for about 30 seconds, and in those 30 seconds I was aware of 3 things: the ticking of the air supply, the weight of 4 presences behind me, and the specific quality of silence that falls when a group of people realizes the situation has just gotten harder. I made a decision. "Kethran," I said, "you mentioned controlled demolitions." "Yes," he said. "If someone were to place a very small, very precisely shaped charge at the weld seam of this panel, in a way that sheared the weld without compromising the structural integrity of the panel itself or the pipe behind it, would you be able to do that?" Kethran looked at the panel. He looked at it for a long time with the careful, measuring attention of someone who does not take these assessments lightly. Then he reached into his tactical vest and produced a small case that I had not noticed before. He opened it. Inside were several small devices, each one about the size of my thumb, that I did not ask him to explain. "Stand back," he said. We stood back. The sound was not loud. It was precise. A sharp, flat crack that seemed to come from inside the wall rather than from outside it. The panel shuddered. 3 of the 4 weld points sheared cleanly. The 4th held for a moment, then gave way when Kethran leaned forward and pushed the panel firmly at a specific angle. The panel opened. Junction 17 was right there, exactly where it was supposed to be. "That," said Seth, with an expression that I could not fully interpret, but that involved both his eyebrows, rising significantly, "was not in the manual. The manual assumes ideal conditions," Kethran said. I looked at Kethran. He was already putting his case away. He did not look at me, but the set of his shoulders had changed again. Less evaluation, more purpose. "Good work," I said. He nodded once, short and precise. I went to work on Junction 17. It was during the repair of Junction 17 that Kethran asked me his question. I was deep in the coupling housing, my arms inside the access port up to my elbows, working by feel because the space was too narrow for my headlamp to angle correctly. The others were nearby, each one doing something useful. Vael was holding the diagnostic unit and reading me pressure values at intervals. Mira was monitoring the overall atmospheric status on her communicator. Seth was cross-referencing the sequencing plan he had built, making sure the order of repairs would not cause a pressure surge when the systems re-equalized. Kethran was watching the tunnel behind us. He did not turn around when he spoke. He said, "Where I come from, when a tunnel collapses and there is no way out, we sing." I kept working. "What do you sing?" "It is not exactly a song, it is more of a record. Names, places, things that should be remembered." A pause. "It is what we do when there is no other option. We make sure someone will know we were there." I felt the coupling click into the correct position. I checked it with my fingers. It held. "Do you do something similar?" he asked. "Humans is, when there is no way out." I thought about it for a moment. The honest answer: "We get angry," I said. "I do not mean angry in a destructive way," I said. "I mean something more specific. There is a point, when things are bad enough, when the rational part of the brain stops arguing with the animal part, and they both just agree. And when they agree, something changes. The fear does not go away, but it stops being in the front. The thinking gets very clear, very simple. One thing, then the next thing, then the next." I checked the coupling one more time. It was correct. I began withdrawing my arms from the access port. "My species spent a very long time on a planet that was trying to kill us," I said. "Cold in winter, hot in summer, storms that flattened everything, large animals that saw us as food, disease, famine. For a very long time, humans were not the most powerful thing on Earth. We were somewhere in the middle, which means that almost every day, something was trying to end us." I pulled my arms free and straightened up. I looked at the diagnostic unit in Vale's hands, amber, moving toward green. "We survived that," I said. "Not because we were the biggest or the fastest or the strongest. Because when the situation became bad enough, we stopped accepting it as a final condition and started treating it as a problem. And humans are very good at problems." Kethran turned around then. He looked at me. In the low yellow light of the tunnel, his face was difficult to read, But I had been watching him long enough to notice the small things. The slight widening of his eyes. The stillness that was not tension but attention. "You are a very strange species," he said. "Yes," I said. "We hear that often. I mean it as respect." I looked at him for a moment, then I nodded. "I know." I checked the diagnostic unit again. Junction 17 was holding. One more junction to go. Junction 18 was the one I had been putting off thinking about. Not because the repair itself was complicated. The repair was straightforward. A pressure release valve that had seized in a partially open position, bleeding atmosphere and a slow, continuous leak. I could fix it in about 15 minutes with tools I had in my kit. The problem was the pipe. Junction 18 was inside a coolant pipe. Not beside a coolant pipe, not under a coolant pipe, inside one. The pipe was wide enough, just barely, for a person of my size to enter and move through to the valve access port. It was also a pipe through which coolant had been running at high pressure until the emergency shutoff had triggered. The coolant was no longer flowing, but the residual thermal output in the pipe walls was significant. I stood at the pipe access hatch and looked at the temperature readout on my communicator. 47 degrees Celsius inside. My suit was rated for 32 degrees of sustained thermal differential. The inside of the pipe was 11 degrees above that limit. The suit would protect me, but not indefinitely. I had approximately 8 minutes before the thermal load on the suit exceeded safe parameters. The repair would take 12 to 15 minutes under normal conditions. I needed to be faster. I began going through the repair in my head, step by step the way Callum had taught me, not imagining it, running it, every hand position, every tool, every turn of every fastener. I ran it 3 times until I had a version that, if everything went exactly right, could be done in 7.5 minutes. "You are going inside that pipe," Seth said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. "The temperature. I know the temperature. Your suit is rated. I know what my suit is rated." A pause. "You have done this before," Seth said. It was not quite a question. Not quite a statement. "Something like it," I said. I did not tell them the details. It did not seem useful. The past is useful for what it teaches you. And what it had taught me was where to put my hands and how to move quickly in a confined hot space, without wasting motion. I looked at the group. "I need someone to monitor the time from outside. At 7 minutes, regardless of what you hear from inside, call it out loudly. At 8 minutes, if I am not out, reach in and take hold of my feet and pull." "Pull you out," Kethran said. "Yes." From a hot pipe. "The access hatch is wide enough for 2 hands to reach in. Your hands are large enough." Kethran moved to a position beside the pipe access hatch without another word. Mira said quietly, "Be careful, Voss." I looked at her. It was the first time she had said my name. "I will be quick," I said. "That is better than careful in this situation." I went in. The heat hit me immediately, pressing in through the suit like a slow, constant weight. Not painful, not yet. Just present. The way a crowded room is warm before it becomes uncomfortable. I moved forward on my elbows and knees, keeping my head down because the top of the pipe was hotter than the bottom. I counted my breaths. The access port was exactly where my mental map said it would be. I reached it in 2 minutes and 14 seconds, which was faster than my estimate. I found the seized valve with my left hand and moved my right hand into position with the correct tool before I took my next breath. The valve was stuck hard. I expected that. I applied pressure at the precise angle that the schematic had told me years ago and that I had verified in my mental rehearsal. The valve did not move. I shifted my weight, changing the vector of force by approximately 15 degrees. The valve moved a fraction. I held the pressure steady. In the tunnel outside, I heard Vale say, 3 minutes. The heat was building. Not dramatically, not dangerously yet, but I could feel it. My hands were steady. The valve turned, slowly then faster. Then it released completely with a small, clean click that I felt more than heard. I verified the seal by pressing my fingers around the housing. No play, no leakage, correctly seated. 6 minutes, Kethran said. From outside, I began moving back. The return was faster than the approach, because I knew the route, and I was moving in reverse from a position of completion, rather than a position of search. I moved as smoothly as I could, keeping my elbows close, not rushing but not 11 minutes, Kethran said. I could see the opening. 3 meters, 2. Voss, Kethran said. "I see it," I said. I came out of the pipe head first, and Kethran's large hands closed around my shoulders and helped me clear the hatch. Not pulling, just steadying, the way you steady someone on unstable ground. I rolled clear and sat up on the tunnel floor. The air outside the pipe felt cold by comparison. My suit was warm against my skin. I sat there for 2 full seconds, just breathing. Then I checked the diagnostic unit. Junction 18, green. I looked up. The 4 of them were standing around me in a loose half circle, and none of them were looking at me the way they had when we first entered the tunnel. Not with distance or caution or careful assessment. They were looking at me the way people look at each other when they have been through something together. "How much air left?" I asked. Kethran said, 1 hour and 14 minutes. 6 junctions repaired, 1 hour and 14 minutes of air remaining. And ahead of us, somewhere past the last blast door, the station waited to either rescue us or run out of time. I got to my feet. "One more problem," I said. "And then we go home." 1 hour and 14 minutes, one problem left. The problem was this: Junction 18 was the last of the 6, and with all 6 repaired, the atmospheric cascade would stabilize. When it stabilized, the station AI would have the technical basis to begin unsealing the blast doors. But the AI would not take that action automatically. It required confirmation data, an atmospheric integrity reading from sensor arrays in grid sections 7 through 23, showing that the repairs were holding and the environment was safe. The sensor array that covered our section was Junction 18's own monitoring system, which had been knocked offline by the same explosion that started all of this. It was not repaired. I could not repair it. It was on the wrong side of a wall that I genuinely could not get through, not without equipment I did not have. Without the sensor data, the AI would not confirm the repairs. Without confirmation, it would not unseal the doors. Without the unsealed doors, we would run out of air in 1 hour and 12 minutes. Seth had already worked this out. "We are still in a loop," he said. "Not the same loop," I said. "A different loop with the same result. The last loop had a mechanical solution. This one has a different kind of solution." I sat down on the tunnel floor with my back against the wall and put my communicator in my hand. "I am going to talk to the station." "The station AI," Vale said. Seth sat down beside me, which surprised me. The Vrethki generally preferred to stand. I took it as a sign of how tired he was. "What will you say to it?" "I am going to give it better information," I said. The station AI communication system in the grid was accessible through the crew communicators. I opened the channel and said, "Station AI, this is Engineering Specialist Voss. I am in grid section 14, please respond." "Engineering Specialist Voss," the AI said. Its voice came from a small speaker on my communicator, and from the wall panel simultaneously, which created a slight echo in the tunnel. "Current status shows you are within the emergency containment zone. Air supply estimate for your section is 1 hour and 11 minutes. "I am aware," I said. "I need you to update your atmospheric integrity model for sections 7 through 23. Sensor arrays in those sections are offline," the AI said. "Integrity cannot be verified." "Then I will give you the readings manually." I looked at Mira and held out my hand. She gave me the diagnostic unit without a word. I read out the pressure values from each junction, one by one, using the data from Mira's unit. 7 numbers, each one corresponding to a specific sensor point in the Concordat Standard Atmospheric Assessment Protocol, each number measured directly from the junction itself. Silence from the AI. "Those readings are consistent with stable atmospheric conditions," the AI said at last. "Yes," I said, "because the junctions are repaired. All 6 of them. I cannot verify this independently." "No," I said, "you cannot. Your sensors are offline. But I have given you the correct data from direct measurement at each junction site. The repairs are complete. The atmospheric system is stable. The cascade has been stopped." Another pause. Longer this time. I had the distinct feeling, which was probably not accurate but felt real, that the AI was deciding something. "Engineering Specialist Voss," it said, "your communicator's diagnostic feed confirms the readings you have provided. The values are internally consistent with completed repairs. However, protocol requires sensor array confirmation before door unsealing can proceed." "I understand the protocol," I said. "I am asking you to make a judgment. The sensor arrays are offline due to the same emergency that caused the containment lockdown. The data needed to satisfy the protocol cannot be obtained through normal means. I am providing you the best available information, obtained directly and accurately. If you wait for the sensor arrays to come back online, the 5 crew members in this section will not survive to see it happen." Silence. I waited. Seth was very still beside me. Kethran had not moved. Vale and Mira were watching my communicator. "Engineering Specialist Voss," the AI said, "I am updating my risk assessment model." "On what basis?" I asked. "On the basis that my current crew variable database does not include a category for direct field verification by a qualified engineer, operating under emergency conditions. I am creating one." I said nothing. "The atmospheric integrity model for sections 7 through 23 has been updated based on your reported measurements. Blast door unsealing sequence will begin in 4 hours and 10 minutes. Consistent with the standard decompression safety protocol for sealed sections. 4 hours and 10 minutes. We had 1 hour and 11 minutes of air, I said. We have 1 hour and 11 minutes of air in this section. I am aware, the AI said. I will be rerouting emergency atmosphere reserves from Section 21 into your section through the maintenance feed valves. This will extend your air supply by an additional 3 hours and 42 minutes. Total extended supply, 4 hours and 53 minutes. This exceeds the door unsealing timeline. Silence in the tunnel. Then Vale made a sound that I could only describe as a breath that had been held for a very long time being let go. Seth put both of his long, angular hands over his own face. It was a gesture I had never seen a Vrethki make before, but I understood it completely. Kethran said very quietly, "You convinced the station to change its own rules." "I gave it better information," I said. "That is the same thing." "Only philosophically," I said. I sat there on the tunnel floor with my back against the wall and my communicator in my hand, and I listened to the faint sound of the atmosphere reserves beginning to feed into our section. It was a low hiss, barely audible, but it was real. Kethran made a sound then. I had not heard him make a sound like it before. It took me a moment to recognize it for what it was. He was laughing. It was quiet, and it was short, and if I had not been paying very close attention, I might have missed it. But it was real, and it was the most unexpected thing that had happened in the entire 4 hours we had been in the tunnel, which was remarkable given the competition. "Something funny?" I asked. "Yes," he said. He paused, not in a disrespectful way, in the way that something is funny when it is also deeply, genuinely remarkable. I thought about that for a moment. "When I was young," I said, "I read a lot of stories about first contact. Humans meeting other species for the first time. In every story, the thing that defined us was usually physical. Our endurance or our creativity, or the fact that we do not stop. Those things are real. But I think the thing that actually defines us is simpler." "What is that?" Vale asked. She had sat down on the floor on the other side of me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence. "We refuse to accept the conditions of our death," I said, "not out of stubbornness, out of habit. It is a very old habit from a very long time ago, when refusing to accept the conditions of your death was the only reason our ancestors were still alive in the morning." Seth had taken his hands away from his face. He was looking at me now with an expression that I could not fully name, but that reminded me of the way a very precise and logical person looks when they have encountered a variable that does not fit their model, and have decided rather than discard it to expand the model. "I want to say something," he said. "Go ahead," I said. "When we entered the tunnel," he said, "I did not believe we would survive. I calculated our chances at under 10%. I said nothing because there was no productive action to take based on that calculation." He paused. "I was wrong. Not about the calculation. The calculation was accurate given the information I had. I was wrong because my information was incomplete. I did not have a variable for you." I looked at him. "I did not have a variable for any of either," I said. "Kethran's demolitions, your sequencing plan, Vale and Mira's direct measurements. I could not have done this without those things." Seth blinked slowly. "That is true," he said, "but it is not the same thing." "It is close enough," I said. We sat in the tunnel for 4 hours and 6 minutes, waiting for the doors to open. We talked, not about the repairs, about other things. Vale told me about the Solani concept of shared problem space, the idea that when two or more minds address the same problem simultaneously, they create something that neither mind could reach alone. Mira told me that she had been terrified when the doors sealed, not of dying, but of dying without finishing a paper she had been writing for 3 years on atmospheric dynamics in confined ring structures. I told her that was the most relatable thing anyone had said to me in 2 years on the station. And she laughed, which I had not heard her do before. Kethran did not talk much during those 4 hours, but he sat close, which for Adorai I later learned is itself a form of communication. When the blast doors finally began to cycle open, the sound they made was enormous and mechanical and deeply satisfying, like the closing chord of a long piece of music. The light from the other side was brighter than the tunnel emergency strips, and I had to shield my eyes for a moment. On the other side of the doors, 8 crew members stood waiting. 2 medics, a structural engineer, 3 security officers, and the station commander, a tall Vrethki named Orath, who looked at our group of 5 with an expression that moved through relief, confusion, and something I could only interpret as bewilderment, in rapid succession. "How," said Commander Orath, "are all of you alive?" Kethran stepped forward before I could speak. He looked at the commander steadily and said, "Sergeant Voss resolved the situation. We assisted." I looked at him. He did not look back at me, but there was something in the angle of his head that told me the choice of words was deliberate. I said nothing. The medics came forward then, and everything became the organized, efficient process of getting 5 crew members checked and cleared and out of the grid. One of them examined the burns on my forearms, which were superficial but real, and applied a cooling compound that made me feel considerably better. Another ran a diagnostic scan on Seth, who was apparently showing mild signs of atmospheric stress. Vale and Mira were checked together, because they stood next to each other, and neither of them moved to separate. Kethran allowed a medic to approach him but waved the scanner away after about 15 seconds, indicating he was satisfied he was unharmed. I sat on a crate just outside the tunnel access and let the medic work on my arms and thought about nothing in particular for a little while. That particular kind of not thinking that happens after a problem is finished, and the brain has not yet decided what to do with the surplus of attention. Later that evening, after the medical review and the debrief and the long, formal report that the commander required in writing before she would let anyone sleep, I was sitting in the station's small crew lounge on the 4th level when Seth came to find me. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Vrethki are not naturally comfortable with open doorways. They prefer walls on both sides. But he stood there and looked at me, and then he stepped fully into the room and sat down in the chair across from mine. "I want to correct something I said," he told me. "When?" "At the beginning. In the corridor before we entered the tunnel. I said that humans have no self-preservation instinct. I was characterizing you as reckless, as irrational. I remember, I said. I was wrong. Not in the specific observation, perhaps. You do enter spaces that other species would not enter. You do take risks that other species would not take. But the characterization was wrong." He paused. He had the careful way of speaking of someone for whom precision matters. "You do not lack self-preservation. You have a different form of it. You preserve yourself by refusing to accept the parameters of the danger as fixed. You change the problem rather than accommodating it." I thought about that. "That is a very generous way of describing the way humans panic," I said. "It is not panic," Seth said with some firmness. "I have seen panic. What you do in there is not panic. It is the opposite of panic. Panic is the mind refusing to engage. What you did was the mind engaging with everything it had." I looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Seth." He nodded. "You are welcome." He stood. Then at the doorway he paused. "The paper Mira mentioned, on atmospheric dynamics in ring structures. What about it?" "She was afraid she would die before finishing it. She is now afraid she will never finish it because she will spend the rest of her time working on a second paper about today." A pause. "She considers that an acceptable trade." He left. I sat alone in the small crew lounge on the 4th level of Keth Varuna Station, and I listened to the station breathe around me, the hum of the atmosphere systems, which were now running cleanly and correctly across all sections, the distant vibration of the power grid, the small constant sounds of a very large structure doing its job. I had spent 2 years on this station, and in all that time I had never felt quite like I belonged here. I was one of 3 humans in a population of 412. The corridors were the wrong shape for human proportions. The meal schedules were calibrated for species that did not need to eat as often as I did. The lighting in the common areas was optimized for eye types different from mine. Every day contained at least one moment of feeling slightly out of place, slightly too small or too different or too human. I sat there in the dark of the lounge and thought that 14 years of living in space, moving from station to station and ship to ship, had never once made me feel as completely and thoroughly human as those 6 hours in the tunnel. Not because I had done something impressive. I was not thinking about the repairs or the doors or the AI. I was thinking about the way Kethran had laughed, the way Mira had said my name, the way Seth had sat down beside me on the tunnel floor, because he was tired and it was real, and there was no reason left not to. The way that, in the end, the most human thing in the tunnel had not been my engineering, or my risk tolerance, or my knowledge of the grid. It had been the simple, ordinary, very old human habit of looking at a room full of strangers in the dark and thinking, well, let us figure this out together. I got up, turned off the lounge light, and went to sleep.